Awesome. I kind of say this a lot, but I'm super excited to talk to you today. Gee, it's been too long, and
It's been too
you're like one of the most pivotal people in my life, really, in a lot of ways. So we'll talk about why. So the way I like to do this is like ask some like big kind of hard questions, and then start back at the beginning and go through your chronology.
long.
But first, like actually, I was curious what do you remember about when and how we first met, like our very first meeting.
Well, obviously at that time we were in a really big cash crunch in our little startup at ATG, and we were also in a kind of a weird market because everyone was really excited about the dot-com internet bubble, and we were doing something very different that no one who was investing, cared about. They're like, "Why are you doing that? Why don't you just do like pets.com?" Or, that was the rage back then. So we were building software and we were just discovering our market, and we had some very good customers like Sony and Harvard Business School and MCI, and serious customers in a market which we hadn't anticipated. We didn't really know much about enterprise software at the time, right? We were a couple of young kids building some neat stuff. um, but the problem was that we didn't have a much outside investment. We had kind of bootstrapped our company just by doing consulting gigs, so we had enough cash to build stuff. But when we started becoming a product company, our customers were big. They paid really slowly, right? So we didn't have enough cash in. No banks would loan us money because they're less than 5 years old. Young companies just don't get credit. And so we had been hoping to get some money from some investors, but they turned out to be, you know, not the greatest guys in the world. And that's when we met, I believe, at that point. And Scott Jones, who's my old boss and really my one of my only mentors that I had when I was younger, came in to bail us out. So I remember you really well. I remember that you struck me as being very practical and pragmatic, and like your questions as to, okay, so what's going on here, even though you didn't know anything about what we did or anything about our market.
I remember you had very nice chairs.
We do have that chance. We used
Like
to get
like
them.
I had the sense like all hell was breaking loose, but like you had like very nice chairs.
Yeah, we got them from
They
all
were
these
very
companies. We
cool.
We had all these Herman Miller chairs that we got in a fire sale because some company was going out of business, and they're like, "Well, take some chairs." And so we took like twice, three times as many as we had people, just in case. And so, yeah, they were really nice. I still like those chairs.
So like probably the hardest question they'll ask all day is what are you most proud of like now? Like all the way from having gone through, quite a career at this point from that point when we met. What
That
do you
is a
suppose you're most proud of?
that is a tough question. You know, the thing that touches me most is that when you see a lot of people who used to work for us at ATG, and a lot of them are in the industry now, and a lot of them are CEOs of other startups, some very successful ones. But they all loved working at the company, and they loved working with the people that were there. So I'd say I was most proud about the culture we built. Joe and I had a specific style that, well, Joe and I are still. I mean, Joe and I have, we met in the fraternity at MIT, right, 1982, and for all those years we sat at the same desk at the company, and like, we're still best friends today. Where I just had dinner with him, 2 days ago, and even though he travels a lot because he has grandchildren all over the place. Um, so an old friendship, but we had a very similar way of looking at the world, and I think it percolated down to to the staff. Um, so we could be tough, but we were always super fair, and I think we created a nice place to work. And I get that, there's whatever groups on LinkedIn or whatever, and people just always say like, "Oh my God, that was just the best place to work," because of the people and how they, how they treated each other. So I'd say
So
that was the most pleasure, right? Is that.
just for the students, so Jeet's co-founder is Joe Chung, and they both met at MIT, and we'll get into that in a minute. But like one of the things that I always found like the most interesting about the company, and we'll talk about what happened at the company, but was the way that you guys actually like fit together because you actually have you're very similar in some ways, but also very different in some
Yep.
ways. And that like you're kind of like the outside guy, like glasses half full, like
Yep.
sales guy, and
Yep.
Joe's like a bit the opposite.
Yep. Yep.
And so like we had, and that I think that was kind of in part the special sauce about how that partnership was so successful. And
Yep.
it's great to hear that you're still best friends and all that, but like in terms of actually our company, like that was crucial.
Yeah, it was, and it kind of harkens back to Scott Jones and Greg Carr, who the people who I worked for at their startup for 4 years before Joe and I started ATG, and Greg and Scott were very similar. Greg was the CEO marketing outside guy, and Scott was the engineer. And they met at a meetup, a Harvard MIT meetup, where engineers would meet people who were interested in business. And Greg was actually at the Kennedy School, and that's kind of how they met. And so when I worked for them, I was employee 13 at their company. I left when we were 400 in 4 years, and basically everything I learned about startups and business was there. I didn't learn much
Yeah.
really at MIT. Um, Except teamwork, which I'll get into. That was like the big contribution of MIT way of thinking about how you work with people. But Scott and Greg's interaction and their style of splitting up things was really interesting to me, and I thought it worked really well, even though they were never really good friends. I mean, they were really very different character-wise, and I know they got on each other's nerves. I was good friends personally with both of them. Um, Although I became a very close friend of Scott Jones's over the years. But to your point, in my case, Joe was the engineer, I was the business guy. We both liked product design, and so we both acted, almost as joint brain when we said, like, how do we build this? Me more conceptually, and he obviously coding it. But Joe was also a very good salesman, which is kind of funny for the tech kind of guy. He loved going and selling. He had to sell CIOs of companies, right? The head of IT at Deutsche Bank or whatever it is. They wanted to meet the CTO. But yeah, you're right. I think we approach things in certain ways very similarly, but our actual day-to-day tasks were really different.
So let's just go to the chronology a little bit before we get back to ATG. So you grew up in India and you went to high school in India. What was that all about? How was that?
No, so my dad was a diplomat. I was born in Sweden,
Okay. All
and
right.
so we lived all over the place. We lived in. I started, nursery school in Madrid. We went to Moscow, so we were in Russia, 69 to 71. We were in Saigon, 71 to 73 during the war. Then we went to Colombia for 4 years. And then after Colombia, my dad was sent to Uganda during Idi Amin's time. So it was not a very stable thing. So I couldn't go to school there. And so at that point, they sent me to boarding school in India, in the Himalayas,
Okay.
at a Christian ex-missionary international boarding school up at 7,000 feet. It was a great place. It was not fancy, but it was a neat place. So I stayed there, and then I liked it a lot. And then I could have joined my folks later when they went to Finland, but I'm like, look, I'm already almost graduating. I'm happy. I got I was an athlete, so played basketball, played volleyball. My girlfriend was there. I didn't want to leave, so I graduated, and then came to Boston. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't really know that background. So do you think like that level of, I mean, it sounds like almost chaos in your where you were living. Did that help you when you got to the tech world? I mean, it sounds like you really had to be adaptive.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, my personality is pretty outgoing. I have friends who grew up like me, and I'd say half of them thrived in kind of like a chaotic environment, and half of them didn't. Right.
Right.
I think I was kind of lucky that I had 4 years in Colombia between 10 and 14. I have really good friends from Colombia. In fact, one of them was just here last week staying with us.
Okay.
He lives in
Okay.
Spain now. And then 4 years stable in India. So I didn't get, jerked around too much when I was, 12 or,
Yeah.
15, which would have been, I think, kind of rough socially. So I was kind of lucky that way. But you do get that sort of outsider mentality, which from a startup point of view, if you're in a startup, you're kind of always the outsider, right? You're outside the regular business. You're not one of the big guys. No one believes what you're going to do, and I guess that sort of outsider mentality is helpful. It's like, all right, sure. I mean, a new place and a new environment. I don't speak the language, so what? Gotta deal with it, right?
So how did you get to MIT?
Well, I think early in high school, I decided that I wanted to come to the States rather than England, which was kind of the options, for most of the kids in the school. Most of the kids were also international. Their parents were everywhere from Indonesia to Saudi Arabia to Aramco. There weren't many international schools in Asia at the time, and my school actually was accredited by the Middle States Association, so you got an actual American high school diploma, and it was a testing center for SATs and APs and all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of a magnet school for international kids from all over Asia who were thinking of coming usually to the States because it was an American school. But you could do the O levels and A levels like England. But I'd chosen by the time 10th grade, I was like, yeah, no, I think I want to go to the States. And so after the SATs and all that kind of stuff, we had it was kind of this little Christian school, and the guidance counselor, I didn't know anything about anything. And they had, some old college, whatever, catalogs on the walls, usually from places like St. Olaf and Oberlin and, the usual somewhat Christian liberal arts schools, and not a hint of like, what about Ivy League or Stanford or MIT or anything like that. And nothing, so I just sort of, there's no internet, right? So, we were up in the Himalayas. So I rode away for catalogs, and those giant catalogs, started coming, and I thought MIT looked like a cool place. I didn't get in. I was on the wait list. I did get into, most of the other places, and I got a full scholarship at Princeton. And my dad was not a rich guy by any means. I think the maximum salary for an Indian ambassador when he was ambassador is $23,000 a year. Although you don't have expenses because you live in the embassy, and your food and chauffeur are free, right? But yeah, so I actually sent in I was on the wait list at MIT, which is a very short wait list, by the way. It's like 12 people at that time. And so I just sent in my papers for Princeton. It was like, hey, it's free, and then I got in off the wait list. And my dad and I visited just before, pre-Frosh. We traveled around the States together, and, visited Caltech and Cornell and blah, blah, and Princeton, MIT. And when I saw Princeton, I really, really didn't like it. It's like they're talking about the presidents and the blah, blah, and the lawn here and the building here. It was like a country club. And I'd been living up in the Himalayas. I was like, I don't want this. When it came to Boston, I was like, oh, this is cool, right? And there, the tour was about like, okay, here are the secret tunnels, and here's where we hack the elevators so we can get into all these places we're not supposed to go to. And that was like the tour, and it was Boston, and there's like restaurants. And so, yeah, so I was like, okay, I want to come here, but I hadn't gotten in, but then I got in.
So just by the way, like everyone in my family, both my siblings, my father, my grandfather, my uncles, all went to Princeton, and I
Oh, cool.
hate it, and I hate it.
Oh,
And
really?
I went to Wesleyan, so which is closer
That's
to
funny.
MIT, much
Yeah.
closer to MIT than it is to Princeton. So God bless. You made the right
That's
choice.
that's pretty funny. So yeah,
So,
so that's
anyways,
out there. Yeah.
so I want to kind of skip forward because I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk
Yeah.
thoroughly about ATG. But just for a second, on your first job was at Bus Technology with Scott Jones, right? And they
No, not really the first.
okay. What was your first job?
So I thought I was going to be an engineer at MIT. I was a mechanical engineer. I realized I didn't really like engineering much because it was sort of like kind of cut and dry. Like, okay, well, I know the equations. We can make this bridge so it doesn't fall down, but there weren't complicated questions. I was really interested in political science and economics, so I ended up majoring in political science at MIT, which is very quant there, right? It's a lot of policy assessment during the wars and so on. So it's not, it's not a Kennedy School kind of place. It's a quantitative like assessment of policy and more mathematical. So that's what I, studied. But then most people in political science either go into politics or they go to the Kennedy School or they go into law, and had no interest in any of those things. And, I didn't want to be a diplomat like my dad. And the only thing I could do is I was a pretty good writer and I could understand technology. So I used to write technical manuals and actually made money in college working for a manual writing company, which paid great. In those days, $12 an hour was like unheard of for a student in college, right? I mean, minimum wage was $2.75. at the time, right? So the only skill I had really, I could write. So I got a bunch of jobs working for a number of tech companies writing, and then often it turned into marketing because like, oh shoot, this guy actually understands about the product, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, that's how I got the job at Boston Technology because they were looking, one of my buddies saw something about voicemail and he knew I was a musician. He didn't really know the difference. He's like, hey, this company looks interesting. You know, they're looking for a writer. Do you want to talk to them? So I did. And so I went in as a technical writer. And it's a pretty interesting story. So BT, speaking of how Greg and Scott met, Greg was studying the breakup of the Bell system, which happened in the 70s. And, you know, now companies could compete. Before it was Ma Bell everywhere, right? AT&T and Ma Bell, basically one giant monopoly. That was broken up in the 70s. But in the 80s, they suddenly said, okay, Bell companies, you can sell additional services too. And the first thing they sold was like call waiting, where your phone would click when you could hear that someone else was trying to call you. And that was, you know, they sold that for $2 or whatever. And that was like their wonderful innovation. But voicemail, you know, was available in companies. Like you could have a system centrally, but at home you just had an answering machine, right? And so the Bell companies with the new laws said, okay, wait a minute, we could sell voicemail, central office voicemail. So they put out RFPs, you know, requests for proposals from dozens of big companies that sold office voicemail. There are companies like Optel and Centigram and Unisys. And they put it out to about 55 companies. And Greg and Scott responded and said, hey, we can do, you know, the biggest voicemail systems had 12 channels max, right, in your office, or 24 if you were, you know, they claimed that they didn't really have it. We claimed 1,500. And Scott had designed a parallel processing version where you just stack up a bunch of PCs basically and put voice cards in all of them and then transition stuff to it. So that was the innovation at Boston Technology, was like, how do you do a big one? And suddenly a new player was coming into the space, which was the phone company, right? And so that's kind of interesting in business in general. Like so many things in business happen because some other thing changes, like a regulation changes, a law changes, and then, oh, everyone has to scramble. And that's kind of a good moment for, you know, startups to enter the fray. So that happened at Boston Technology.
Yeah, so you guys understand, like basically, like this company. I mean, they didn't invent voicemail, but they kind of did actually. Definitely domestically. Not, and there was voicemail, like you said, like Jeet
In
said,
company.
like commercially, but no one had it at home. These
Yeah.
guys provided it, so like
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
a big market.
Yeah. It's like, well, yeah, like Google didn't invent search, but they perfected it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So let's I want to get into ATG. So it was started really as a consulting company, then you started building this enterprise product, and that's when kind of I showed up. And then what happened? Like how do we get from like where we were you're running out of money to we were going that was November of 97 in my
Yeah.
recollection anyways. And I think we went public July of 98. So
Yeah.
that was like
Or
not
99. Yeah.
that or 99, I'm sorry. So it was like it was like 18, 20 months or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we go from like running out of money, not quite sure what the hell we're doing, to going public 20 months later? What happened during that period of time?
Yeah. So, I mean, so to kind of understand that properly, you know, you sort of have to realize that, you know, since we started as a consultancy doing kind of, you know, wacky interactive media, this is a brand new market in the time. Joe came out of the MIT Media Lab, and most of our early employees all were from there too. Since we were doing this sort of high-end consulting, you know, we made good money, but then usually if you build a product, you take in a bunch of investment because it takes years, right, to build a product and then market it, and you have to invest a lot. We were just kind of doing it on our own kind of profits from consulting. So that was, you know, I wouldn't suggest that as an approach. I mean, it worked for us, but barely, right? We almost ran out of money, obviously, more than once, usually because of either lack of credit or, you know, at the time you guys came in, there was such a big market bubble around a different kind of technology than what we were doing. No one really got it until a couple of years later. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, right? This is kind of interesting after all. So in some senses, by the time we took the SoftBank money, which was about 7 million or something along those lines, I think, even later before we went public, we didn't even use any of that money. But by that time, we were a little scared of running out because we'd been in trouble before. So I think by the time we made that transition, we also were starting to get really good revenue from our customers. So we had that sort of valley of death moment, which you guys bailed us out of, right? But that was like it was a consequence of the fact that the model of changing from consulting to product is a difficult one to do. And the things that you're known for are not the things you're saying you want to do, right? And most investors are like, well, wait a minute, this is not what you do. Like, what makes you think you can compete against the biggest companies in the world, like Microsoft and IBM?
So, guys, just so you understand the context here, what this product was all about. So, imagine a world where no one is selling anything on the internet. And like basically the consulting work that Jeet and Joe were doing was helping companies figure out how to sell on the internet, right? And so then they built a product which was basically the first e-commerce product platform for people to transact on the internet ever.
Yeah.
And they were selling that product. And so while there was internet, companies that were, basically, a joke, trying to like basically set up, pets.com or whatever the hell it was. We were actually enabling the world to start transacting on the internet,
Yeah.
which turned out to be a great business model.
Yeah, Amazon had started doing that for themselves, and and as Tom's pointing out, in general, people weren't selling on the internet, and suddenly they all wanted to, and so now they had to get a product to do it, and that was where we were. That was the space we were playing. The secret sauce, besides just selling on the internet, for us was this idea of personalization. Now we just take it for granted that whatever you click on your social media is based on what you've done before. But this didn't exist back then, and so people wanted like, oh well, if Tom likes this sweater, shouldn't we show him these pants as well, right? That was like a novel concept of personalizing the web page, which means that you had to set up a web page specifically for every single person looking at it, and that didn't exist. And that was like our real, secret sauce, and also the basis for the lawsuits with Broadvision and so on, which is a pretty funny story. But we were, and going public was very much related to this Broadvision lawsuit. So to get back to your other question, a lot of stuff was going on. The biggest thing that was going on is we were stealing away customers from our main competitor, who was already public, and they had hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank. And we were trying to sell to, American Express and to, whatever it was, to American Airlines and Blockbuster and big banks and so on. And our competitors go and say, well, hey, listen, you're going to go with these, kids who they don't have any money. No one knows them. And here we are, a big public company with $100 million in the bank. So we were losing, and we were still winning. And then Broadvision sued us right around that time, because I think they realized that they didn't want us going public, and then suddenly they'd lose the one thing they could say against us, which is we were small and underfunded. So that was all happening in those same months, Tom. And so a lot of we were at that point pretty close to profitability already. The customers are good, but having the war chest and especially having credibility versus Broadvision was, a big reason why going public was a good strategic decision, right?
So, what was the experience like of being on the roadshow? I mean, I'm sure these guys are interested.
Oh, it's just hellish. It is just the most hellish thing. So on the roadshow, if you guys don't know what it is, like when you want to sell shares to the public, you get an investment bank to come in and be your broker, basically, right? And then they go sell to a whole bunch of private investors and other banks the first tranche of your, a small piece of your company, 5 or 10%, and then then it's available for trading in the market. But the investment bank, which is really a broker of shares that you're selling, right? I mean, they're just market makers in a lot of ways. So they have to convince all these investors, at this price, you should do it. And then they take orders in a book. But since the market can change so quickly, and something happens, there's a war, whatever it is, there's a market downturn, that they have to price that within a very small window, usually a couple of weeks, right? So in a couple of weeks, you got to literally meet in person all these fund managers all over the world, mostly in the US, but then Europe and so on, Asia. And you got to meet them all, and they want to shake your hand, and you tell them the same story that they could hear in a PowerPoint if you want to, but they want to meet you. And you do this a gazillion times a day, every day, while you're traveling at night or whatever for 2 weeks. And it's horribly exhausting, and it's boring because you say the same thing for 45 minutes, 5 times in the morning. At lunch, you don't even get to eat because they're talking while the other people are eating lunch, the Capitol Grill or whatever. And then you do it in the afternoon. And then at the end of it, the fund manager tells your banker, like, okay, we're in for X number of million, dollars worth of shares or whatever it is. And at the very end, on our last day, we were actually at Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. And after the last meeting, we literally sat in the limo talking to, all the bankers, like, okay, are we in? Is that price? Are we going to go? And they're like, okay, we priced the deal. And, basically a couple of days later, we're whatever it was the next day, we're trading, right? So it's kind of nutty, and you're talking so frequently, saying the same things, you start losing track of what you're saying. and like, Joe, okay.
So it's actually you're breaking up there a little bit, but if you can hear me, one of the things that's actually fascinating is, so part of our class is we have a woman who's come in teaching students public speaking. And like, part of my mantra is like that's the most important, that's one of the most important skills you could ever learn. And like
Yep.
all of life can kind of be reduced to, a selling moment or like a political campaign. And God only knows, like a roadshow is a political campaign. You have a stump
Yep.
speech, and you're gonna tell it
Yep.
like 10 times a day, like every single day. And
Yeah.
the quality of your stump speech like
Yep.
really matters. Like it
Yep.
really truly matters.
Yeah, no, it's real. It's definitely true. Communicating the idea, and the idea is sometimes you're communicating. You're not selling Coca-Colas, right? So it's a complex thing that's in a new industry, and so part of that is like, how do you translate to the things that the fund manager will understand. And the investment bankers do a lot to help hear the things to hit on, because these are the parts they're thinking about something else. They're thinking about this whole new market sector, so talk about that because that's what they're interested in, right? So that's it certainly is a good lesson. Once we went public, we had a PR agency and so on, and before I go on CNBC or something like that, right, they actually trained me, which is absolutely fantastic. And in my gap year program, I actually taught young people like you guys some of these skills, which is tape yourself, give a talk, watch yourself. Like, are you making funny movements with your hands? Are you talking too quickly? Are you, not taking enough pauses to let people catch up? So that was very good exercise, and only happened, once we were a public company, which is kind of funny, but unnecessary. You could learn that stuff in school, right?
Yeah, we definitely, these guys are definitely doing all that. I don't know why your video froze there. I don't know if you can reset that. Um,
Was it
but
me?
yeah, I'm not sure
That's
what's going
probably
on
me.
there.
Probably just
But
got me. Yeah.
I can actually So I do remember you guys being on Sand Hill Road. I remember that pricing call,
Yeah.
which was hilarious. And then um, the next point was, so we were fortunate enough that the stock was trading well enough that we did a secondary that November. So it was July went public, and then whatever it was, 4 or 5 months later, we're selling more shares.
I
And
didn't think it was that soon, wasn't it? Wasn't it like about a year or so later? I think it wasn't quite that quick. It was about a year and a bit later, I think, on the
okay,
second.
so
I
whenever
may be wrong.
whenever we did this secondary, but I remember very clearly the pricing call on the secondary.
Yeah.
And so from our perspective, like my little group of people, I just remember dialing into that call because that was actually the first time that we were going to be able to sell a
Cash out some.
significant portion of shares.
Mhm.
And I remember doing the math and
Yeah.
like where the price of the shares came out in the secondary, where we were able to sell some of our shares was just north of 100 times our cost basis. And so like I was like literally like I was in this offsite in Vermont
Yeah.
with my I had a venture capital firm at that point, and I was with my team, and I'm like in this upstairs bedroom, and I just remember like I was like shaking because
Yeah.
like it was like real money to me at that point. Um, and then so the next point is so just to explain to the guys, so when you go public, the banker, the broker, they force you to sign a lockup agreement.
Right.
Um, and so what that means is that if you're an insider, they don't want you flooding the market. They want to actually create a liquid market first, and you can only sell into that market after it's established. So that generally means that for 6 months you can't trade. And so even though on paper you may be worth a certain amount of money, it doesn't really matter because until the lockup comes off,
You can't sell it.
you can't
Right.
sell it. And
Yeah.
so the 100, so that's 180, it's generally 180-day lockup. And so the 181st day is a really, really big day. It's an
Yeah.
important day.
Yeah.
And so my recollection anyways, that was like February of 2000, I believe. Um, and, uh, and I remember that morning, like, because there was a bunch of people who had actually shorted our stock. And so there was downward pressure.
Because
And so
people
the way
thinking like,
this,
oh, founders are gonna clean out a bit and they'll
right,
drop. Right. Right.
right. And so the way that that works is that if you understand market dynamics, if people are shorting, and then a bunch of people show up to buy the stock, so the stock, actually trades up, and then those shorts have to cover, it actually accelerates
Yeah.
the way that the stock moves. And so the
Yeah.
stock will then start to move up more dramatically because the shorters have to like bail out, basically.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened that day is like, basically like we have a paper amount of wealth, but now this is the first day that the paper amount of wealth is actually going to be liquid. We know there's a bunch of shorts,
Yeah.
and like they may eat our lunch and the stock may trade down, but in fact what happened is the stock traded up
Yeah.
significantly.
They bet wrong and lost sort of twice on that one, right?
Well, but like, and for us, I
Yeah.
mean, and honestly, like, this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because like that was life-changing money to me. That was like this, that was the single day I made the most money of my entire life. And it was like at that point, it was like my life will never be the same. And so so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for bailing us out. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten there.
So do you remember that when the lockup came off? Do you remember that day?
No, not really. I mean, we went on to selling plans. Joe and I and all the senior managers went on to. Oopsie, wasn't something. Oh, you know what?
There you are. You're back.
Oh, that was something weird. I just got a note saying started again, but
Okay.
yeah. So so one of the things that founders do, especially our senior people, so they don't freak out people or don't get dinged for insider trading, is that instead of actually choosing, okay, well, I'm going to sell 10,000 shares or 1,000,000 shares, they actually put it into a blind selling pool, which you don't know when your bank will sell your shares, over a period of time, over a quarter. And I have no idea when those days are. So no one can blame me for saying like, oh, you knew you guys were just about to, lose a big customer, and before you got into the news, you sold shares, right? That insider trading, which happens, you see it a lot. So we didn't really want to be in that situation. So we were in a blind selling situation where we had no control, and it was sold kind of over time. Um, but to be frank, at that time, I wasn't really thinking about that at all. I mean, there was so much going on as a public company. We were growing, and everything was kind of. I mean, the market was also starting to get a little weird already. So there was a lot going on. I wasn't. I can't remember thinking at all about the shares at that time. It was pretty busy going.
So we're kind of getting to time. So let me ask you a few more kind of a bit off topic questions. So I know you've always been a musician, and like there was a period of time after ATG where you had a band. And so how do you think about your passion for music and technology and how those kind of weaved in together?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I kind of fundamentally think of myself as a creative person. So, what I'd like to do, and Joe likes to do, and Joe's also a musician. We played in a band together in the fraternity, and then we won the Battle of the Bands at MIT. There were like 55 bands. And then WBCN was sponsoring the competition. And so by winning it, we got to play all these, the Rat and TT the Bears and Jonathan Swift and all the big rock clubs in Boston. So I actually took off a year from MIT just to play rock music at that time, and then suddenly realized, okay, I better graduate, because I'm going to need a job. And the $50 that the band gets split 5 ways ain't gonna, do much for my living. So music's always been a big part of my life. And then around that time, after we went public and after a couple of years after the IPO, I was pretty burnt out. And running the public company part is just not much fun, right? Before that, I'm mostly dealing with engineers and designers and customers, which is a lot of fun and very creative and like, how do you solve problems? After you're public, I was spending 80% of my time talking to bankers and lawyers, which are really not the most fun people to talk to, and nothing interesting going on there. You just say the same old thing, just like in the roadshow. Like, oh yeah, we think things are going pretty well. I remember on one, I don't know, you're probably on this call, Tom, but there was one call where, everyone sort of liked all these companies that made no money and, were losing money, but getting customers, and we were profitable. And I remember one on the investor call, someone said like, how come you guys are profitable? So I said, we actually spent less money than we made. Everyone around the table was like trying not, on the conference call not to giggle. But yeah, no, I diverged. But running the public company was becoming, very, I wouldn't say stressful. It was becoming really boring and difficult. And I was traveling all the time. And at that point, I was like, okay, it's time to go back to music. So that's when I moved to, to the islands, when I moved to St. Bart's, set up a studio, and I played music for the next 10 years, right? And traveled around the world with the band. And, we played in, all kinds of countries and did, crazy stuff. We put out 4 albums in those 10 years. And so it was a much needed break. And then later on, 10 years later, then Joe and I got together to do Red Star and start some more companies again.
Yeah, so tell me what just as we wrap it up here, what's Red Star all about, and kind of what's been a few of the wins there, and kind of what's your unique approach?
Well, so we stopped starting new companies about 5 years ago at Red Star. So we did it for about 10 years. We started about 5 companies. A couple of them got acquired. We didn't have any big financial successes. We did have one company that was doing really pretty well called Third Channel, but it was a retail data analytics. And when COVID hit, all our customers, like, they were shut down. There's no retail, right? So unfortunately, that company sort of got snapped up by a specialist investment firm, kind of a distressed debt kind of a acquisition, where the company's actually doing pretty well. It's still out there, but Red Star didn't make any money out of it. We got kind of washed out by the PE buyers that came in. So Third Channel, you can look up Third Channel. So that's out there. We started that. There was another company, a couple other small companies got bought, but they're small sales, a couple $1 million. So nothing to write home about. But the concept of Red Star was very different. It was like, let's come up with a bunch of ideas with a group of people and then find managers to go run them. So Joe and I were like, let's do the stuff we like the best, which is let's come up with some cool ideas, build the team, the first product, the first 2 years of it, fund that piece with our own money, and then find outside investors, but also put in a CEO that matches which market it's going to be in. Because, when you start a product, you don't even know where you're going to be selling it. And so that was the idea of Red Star. I'd say it was a limited success. It was not a success financially for Joe and me. But it was fun and it was interesting. And we came up with some cool companies. We stopped doing it about 5 years ago because, it just takes so long to get companies going. And, Joe and I are both, 61. So we stopped doing that about 5 years ago. And so I'm not running any, and about 2 years ago, I stopped running one of the firms. So I've not been running a company as CEO for a little over 2 years now. But I've been doing actually research now. So about 5 years ago, I started doing a bunch of research on my own. So I do music now. I do research in computational theory, and I'm writing a novel. So
There you go.
those are my
What do you
back to writing again, where I started this whole
so
thing.
what so just for these guys who are 19 and 20 years old just starting out on their business career, kind of what general guidance would you give them as they're trying to figure out what to do and how to navigate the world in 2025?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, again, the where we started from, and one thing that MIT taught me is that don't try to solve any problems on your own. You know, you got to have a team, or at least a good partner that you can bounce ideas off, because it's really easy to get, infatuated with an idea you have. And Joe and me, it was really interesting because our instant reaction is to disagree with each other, and then we'll talk it out, right? And we're usually sitting at the same desk, and I'll be like, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we do that?" And he's like, like, that doesn't sound so good to me, right? And it became our thing. Like, we would just immediately disagree and then sort of debate ourselves until I was like, okay, maybe you're right. And that's very useful. So don't surround yourself by yes people. And find someone you can trust, or a group of people you can trust, when you're trying to put together a business idea, when someone can shoot holes in it. So that's, I think, really valuable, and it's very valuable if you want to do a startup, which is not all businesses are startups, but in startups it's particularly important to have that kind of partner to bounce ideas off of, and also to support you when you're down, because there are times when you just don't have the energy, but then somebody else does, right? And someone else can pick up the call with the client, or the guy complaining at you because your product doesn't work. So I'd say do that. The other thing is, I mean, depending on what you guys are studying, it's hard to study business in school. And I've done a lot of teaching at Sloan, at MIT, and at HBS, and so on. I'm always struck by how little is kind of learned in those sessions, including in mine. So it's getting out and doing stuff is a much better lesson to learn. But finding a company, like for me, Boston Technology was great because I learned about how a small company grows, which is exactly what I needed to start our own. And so some people go to a big company and then they want to do a startup, but they don't learn anything about startups in a big company. And a company that's between 100 and 200 people is very different than a company between 50 and 100, or 0 and 10. And so I think one thing to look at is, when you're looking for a job, if you want to think about the environment you want to be in, and try to find a job that matches what you're trying to learn about. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Obviously, you get to take the job you can get. But looking for a big bank job is very different than looking for a small investment management firm, or looking for a job in a big retail company is very different than getting a job at a consultancy that advises big retail companies like Coca-Cola, whatever. So environment is the different kinds of business environments are very different from each other. And the more you can get out into the world, whether it's through an internship, or, having some friends, or, your folks' friends, let you go shadow them for a week, is a very useful way of kind of getting a landscape. Because when I was, your age, I just didn't know anything about anything. Right. And even when we were selling software to these big companies, I didn't know how they worked, right? I thought we'd be selling stuff like Microsoft, like $50 a thing. And I realized, no, you sell it at $1 million a pop, and it's a completely different world. And you need, Arthur Andersen consultancy to sell them 5 million of consulting on top of your $1 million in software. So, we learned those things the hard way.
Cool. All right, let's stop there and I'll get a couple questions from the guys, and then I'll wrap it up, and we'll get you out of here within an hour.
One book. Well, if there's one subject, maybe it's not the book. There's one subject that I would suggest that you understand, and it's terribly badly taught. It's taught as statistics and probability and so on. I think almost everything in the world, if you understand that if you look at the aggregate, it's going to look a certain way, and at the individual level, it's not, right? So it's kind of like this, it's the bell curve concept, right? You have to understand that when you look at a system, a society, economics, anything, leaves on a tree, the big picture is going to have a certain shape that you have to understand the tree. But any individual leaf you pick is going to be different in its own kind of way. And understanding that, at a deep level, is sort of a good way of understanding a lot of stuff. It's understanding markets, understanding society, understanding politics. It's like, how could this be going on? Like, how could someone be saying that? Until you realize, well, there's always someone saying everything, and what does that look like? So, um, um, as a topic, I think that's the one where most people just don't learn that enough. And when it's taught in such a horrible way, and statistics and probability classes it's kind of incomprehensible. But if you study it in like biology, for instance, okay, I see what they're getting at. Here's a patient population. What happens when you put in this cancer drug, right? So I'd say that's super useful. I mean, there's probably a couple thousand books in the room here. I read a lot of stuff that's history, history in economics and history in markets. And so those are really useful books to read, because I think people don't study history enough. They don't realize that a lot of things we are, thinking about, like, we're not the first ones to think about it, and they may have been thinking about it from 2,000 years ago. And some of the answers are there, and some of the questions are still there. And so then that's, true for politics as much as physics, right? I mean, I read a lot of physics for a completely different reason, because those are my interests now. But yeah, let's see. Yeah. Speaking of the bell curve, I would read the bell curve. It's probably one of the most significant works in social studies in the 20th century. Most people have never read it and condemn it without understanding what it's actually about. So that's not a bad book. It's right there.
Two questions that I use to wrap it up. One, what's your favorite movie?
That's a tough one. I love movies. It's funny when you're young, you're like, oh my God, this is my favorite movie. And then, when you get older, you sort of start to go back and rewatch movies. And I was thinking about your question. And I think quantitatively, I would say the movie I've seen again and again the most is Alien, which I think is one of the most perfectly built movies. And also, I know a lot about how it was made. It was made on, a very low budget, and they had to do all this wacky stuff to do the effects. And it was kind of brilliant how Ridley Scott, did it. And it's kind of like it's a perfect science fiction movie. I love science fiction, but it's also a perfect horror movie. But it's also set up so well about sort of like these, blue collar guys in the ship, in the Nostromo. So I guess I'd have to say, just quantitatively, I've seen Alien more times than any other movie. Godfather
So,
or Brazil or whatever, right?
so last question. Do you want to leave the guys with one word to remember as they go out and try and conquer the world? What would the word be?
Oh, yeah. The word is we, right? It's not me. It's we. And I think the teamwork thing, the teamwork dynamic is sort of like, for me, the most important thing. It goes back to like, what did I think about what the best thing I'm most proud of in the thing? It's the team, right? The ATG team, which still today, you're right. Not only am I in touch with, but they still do stuff together, and whatever, however many years it's been later, right? So yeah, the word is the word. I think the word is we.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for spending an hour with us. It was a
Hey,
lot of fun, and
pleasure, guys.
thanks for your being a teammate at ATG. It was like incredible journey together. So, and let's catch up soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. That'll be fun.
All right, talk to you later, man.